You're listening to Career Interrupted. This is your host, Joy Foster. And today we have a guest who has vast experience with neurodiversity, not just for herself, but also with her children. And she's going to bring that experience to our conversation. So, Bea Marshall, welcome to the Career Interrupted podcast. I'm delighted that you're here, and we're going to have a great discussion about your career or not career, as you might call it. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Joy.
All right, let's get stuck in. So I asked you in the pre-prep for this call, how many career interruptions you've had, and you had a really interesting answer for me. So let's start with that question. How many career interruptions have you had?
So really the place to start is that I don't think I've ever had a career. So I haven't had anything to be interrupted. What I have had is a journey through my work life with lots of pivots and moments of pause, moments of acceleration, moments of intensity, moments of lull. Possibly now that I'm in my mid-40s, I might just be entering into a career, but I'm not even sure if that's true either.
But you've obviously figured out how to navigate the world and make money without having a career, in those words. What were some of the things that have caused you to not have a career? Have in the words that we all relate to a career?
Yeah. So I've often had the experience of I don't tend to fit in with conventional norms. For example, I started 2 degrees and I didn't finish either of them, not because the degrees themselves were difficult, but because I was just off doing other things. So I was like leaving my studies to go and do this or that. And everything about who I am is interest driven. I just have an interest driven nervous system. If I'm bored, I'm not productive. I actually am almost paralyzed by boredom. So I've just gone about following my interests. So I give you a really brief potted history of my work. So I worked as a support worker for disabled students at the university in the city where I live. And then when my manager left his job, I applied for his job and I took over. So then I was the manager for all of the support workers in the university. Became pregnant. I left on maternity leave to have my first baby. That was when I was 26. And the nature of the role was a role that I couldn't go back to part-time, but I was really relieved because in that role, I used to get excited if I was able to put color on a spreadsheet. Now, if that's the level of excitement I'm getting, it's not the right role for me. So I really kind of embraced motherhood. I was married to my boy's dad and we set up a web design company together. So, actually, I forgot. In the middle of all of that, I designed a range of clothing called Booby Juice. And it was breastfeeding clothing before that was even really a thing. Because of stuff that happened in my life, we never got to production, but we did pre-production and samples and things. Then set up this web design company with my husband, and we did that together so I could work around my kids and everything. And then we separated when my boys were 6 and 8, and it just wasn't possible to run it together. So then I kind of had to find my way, and I've dipped in and out of everything's kind of revolved around helping people, whether as a coach or then as an energy therapist. I also hold space in women's circles and women's work. So I've just kind of moved in and out of things. But one of the things that's really developed since probably about 2014 is my focus on parenting and supporting parents. But then in the last 6 years, since finding out that I'm neurodivergent, this whole other area has opened up. So that's taken me into delivering training and consultancy around neurodiversity. So it's been really varied. And I've just kind of flowed, always responding to kind of what's in front of me and how does that invite me to pivot or respond.
And clearly, not knowing that you were neurodivergent for 4 decades of your life really had an impact on what was happening in that career flow, if you will, but also having children in the middle of that, and then discovering that your children as well had neurodiverse traits and needed support. And you touched on something really important, and I think this affects a lot of women's ability to work, is divorce, separation. So here you built a company with your partner and you separated and you're no longer together. And that's a pretty difficult place to be in when you're now a single mom with 2 children who you've discovered are neurodiverse, and you've got to figure it all out. So was that when the stakes were highest for you at that moment? What was it like?
Yeah, so that was an incredibly difficult time. I'm someone who feels things really intensely, like big emotions. They're part of who I am, and I've learned not to try and minimize my emotions. I've learned how to kind of ride the wave of them. And it's actually one of the things that I help other people, other parents especially, to do now. When my marriage ended, it came as a complete shock. So I had a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old. I didn't know that any of us were neurodivergent at that point. So I was reeling in this sudden change, which as an autistic individual, but not knowing I was autistic, that sudden unexpected change was very, very challenging. Then I was grieving my marriage, but not so much. Like, it turned out that quite quickly I realized that actually I was better off not being married to my then husband. But I was grieving the future that I had imagined us having. And then when I realized it wasn't tenable to continue the business together, I went through a huge process of grief around having to let that go. Like, it was, I mean, you know what it's like setting up your own business. Like, you birth something, you create something, can you birth it? And the connection you have with your business or with your brand is really hard to describe to someone. It's so different to feeling loyalty to the brand of a company that you're employed by. So I had to kind of release that to him, and there was grief around that. I was home educating my sons, but because I just didn't know what the heck does it look like for me to flow money into my family, to be the mum that I want to be, to meet my son's needs. There was a lot going on. My boys went into school, which turned out actually not to be ideal for them or for me. But it was this moment of everything was up in the air. And I just had no idea how it was going to land. I didn't know what it looked like.
And at that moment, what was your biggest fear? You know, when you're in a situation like that, there's got to be a fear that's coming up for you.
Yeah, of course. I mean, lots of fear. At that moment, the biggest fear for me was that before I found out I was neurodivergent, I always felt like I was failing. I just didn't understand how most other people seemed to just like flow through life, like things were relatively easy. Of course, adversity hits all of us, but it just always felt like everyone else was just finding things easier. And I just always felt like I was failing. And the biggest fear for me was that as someone who had managed to work out the skills to mask, to show this really like confident front, that was all going to crumble, and that everyone would essentially discover me for the failure that I actually was. And I guess attached to that would have been fear of rejection, abandonment, isolation. It was really intense because in my marriage, I was 23 when I got married. And I think I felt like I ticked the marriage box. I had that lifelong place of belonging. I had that lifelong kind of love that I would give and receive. I think it just came out of nowhere. And I just thought, gosh, everything's going to crumble and people are going to see me for this failure that I then thought that I was. Yeah.
Mm. And I mean, obviously I want to know how you navigated that. And I know our listeners are going to want to know that too. What was the most surprising thing that came out of that period of time for you?
So this all happened in my mid-30s. And I think the thing that surprised me most was that I discovered I'm actually okay on my own. In some ways, I was better on my own. Like, we'd had a very difficult marriage, but I'm one of these people that really fights for things. And I will fight to keep something as it is because I might not want to let it go. And then because I was having to do everything on my own, my experience of things changed. And I started realizing with my youngest son that he had a very different relationship with words, letters, reading. There were other things that I was noticing. And so I sorted out for him to have an assessment and found out that he was dyslexic and dysgraphic. And then the assessor said to me, I'd really recommend that you organise a referral for an autism assessment. And my first thought was, what? He's not autistic. And I didn't know much about what it meant to be autistic then, but I just was like, he's not autistic. Well, through that process of, and if any of your listeners have gone through this process, like, it's such a big energy ask to go, certainly in the UK, to go through the process of a referral for assessment, and it's hard. But my natural tendency was to go, right, I'm going to go and find out everything I can about what it means to be autistic so that I can start making changes now, because I really don't believe that we need to have a label to respond to the child or the person in front of us. And everything that I came across, I was like, yeah, that's him. And I was like, that's me. That's him. That's me. That's him. That's me. Like probably about 95% of it. And I had this realization that, oh, okay, yeah, he is autistic, but flipping heck, I think I'm autistic too. And this went over several years. I was 40 when I realized that I was autistic, but that has changed everything. And if we're talking about like career interruptions, even though I haven't necessarily had a career, like that moment of realizing that I was autistic was a significant interruption in a really positive way. It interrupted this experience of feeling like I was always failing. I was never good enough. I couldn't get my life together. I couldn't, so many things that I was just like, I just can't do this like everyone else can. And that's changed everything. So everything post 40 is totally, totally different.
That's incredible. So what are some of the lessons that you took away from this experience and discovering that you yourself indeed were autistic, and what is the motto that's come out of this that you live by?
So what I've really taken away from discovering that I'm autistic, and also my journey as quite a typical autistic person, is I deep dive into things. So I've since discovered that I'm ADHD. I'm also PDA. That stands for pathological demand avoidance, which is a horrible term. So I prefer pervasive drive for autonomy. But I've discovered these things about me. So my neurodivergent identity is really strong. In the middle of all of that, I've had to really face a lot of internalized ableism that is just part of the conditioning that I think so many of us in this culture have. And I've then come to this place of like, gosh, it makes so much sense. Now I know this about me. I'm not a failure. I'm just different. It makes sense of why I pivot and move in the direction of my interests. It makes sense why I struggle with unexpected changes or unpredictability. It makes sense why I can sometimes have this rigidity around my thoughts or my ways of doing things. Like, so much makes sense. And in that process, I've been exploring my son's neurodivergence and then understanding it in other people. So the really big takeaway from that is I'm exactly how I'm meant to be. And I really like me. I no longer try to change me. You know, I do move through the world really differently, and that is okay. And I know some people who move through the world in the kind of way that society seems to want us to, which is, you know, you get a job and you stick in that job and you're diligent, and which is not me. But there are some people for whom they really thrive in that. And I can really embrace those differences, and that I'm exactly who I'm meant to be. And that if I'm in alignment with myself, whatever I'm doing, whatever choices I'm making, then that's what's right for me. And so one of the things that actually came about a year after my marriage ended was something called yes parenting. And it really came into its own in not just around parenting, but around the whole of my life after realizing that I was autistic. Because within yes parenting, one of the things that I help parents understand or embrace is rather than how I think I should respond to this parenting situation, is ask the question, in this situation, what would be a yes to joy, peace, connection, and ease? Because we're so focused on like trying to change a behavior or get our child to do something. But actually, if we come back and we're like, what's a yes to joy, peace, connection, and ease, then often we can find a really beautiful way through. And so I started asking myself that question, like, I don't know, is going to the coffee shop with my friend, like, let's say I love going to the coffee shop with my friend, and my friend contacts me and says, do you want to go for a coffee, I don't know, on Thursday? I'll check in and I'll just check in with myself. Is that a yes to joy, peace, connection, and ease? And sometimes it absolutely is, so I'll do it. And sometimes it's not. And I'm at the point now where I can just do that in a moment. I don't have to kind of take several seconds to work it out. But it's brought this real simplicity to how I go about creating the life that I live now, how I make decisions in my parenting, in my marriage, in my business, in my friendships, whatever it is. I bring it all back to, is it a yes to joy, peace, connection, and ease? And it's profound. And for me, it is, I mean, it might not be, I haven't actually met anyone yet who says that doesn't work for me.
I love what you just said, because as I was thinking about it, taking your example of someone inviting you for a coffee, for me, that would, depending on the person, it would be a yes to joy, peace, and connection. But often it's not a yes to ease. Like, I got to squeeze someone in, or I got to move this thing around, or I've got to cancel that thing. Or so ease to me would be like, okay, I can do it on this day in like 3 months, but that would be the ease for me. Right.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really, really, really great question to ask.
Can I share with you how I've got around that for myself? Because
yes,
that was the thing for me. So with my core friends, when we spend time together, before we separate, we put the next date in the diary. Because otherwise, what we have found is, you'll wait until 3-4 weeks later and you'll be thinking, oh, I'd love to meet up with Joy again for coffee. But then trying to get your diaries to connect without creating that kind of that pressure or that kind of friction is really challenging. So all of my friends and I, we say, right, let's get something in the diary straight away. It normally means we can put it in the diary 4 weeks from now, 3 or 4 weeks from now. But 3 or 4 weeks from now is like when we know we're going to want to see each other again. And that's created beautiful ease. Yeah.
Oh, I love that. Well, and of course, saying yes to the podcast must have been easy because my name's Joy. That's one of your requirements.
And I love being interviewed. In my TED talk, I talked all about this unexpected journey that I suddenly have of being catapulted into the British media. And in fact, it ended up being global media. I was featured in Australia and America as well. And I think even some European countries. But anyway, that was a real baptism by fire. But what I learned about it is that part of who I am and this way that I love to just respond to the energy is I love being interviewed. I love being interviewed. I do stuff on live radio. I've done stuff on live telly. I've also done non-live media, and I don't enjoy it nearly as much. But if it's live, it's like my happy place. As long as I'm talking about something that I'm interested in. Don't ask me about politics or, I don't know, maths or something.
I love that. Well, and as a person who's also ADHD, I relate to a lot of that for sure. And I also prefer lives. I struggle massively with pre-recorded stuff, and I'll have to do it 100 times to even create just a 5-second clip. So I prefer live. Well, thank you for that conversation and sharing with us, how you've navigated some real challenges, but also some fantastic discoveries. How can people find you if they want to know more about your yes parenting?
Well, so I'm on social media. When I say I'm on social media, I have a wonderful team who support me brilliantly, and they take care of my social media stuff. But at b.the.tree is my Instagram handle, and Facebook is facebook.com/Bea Marshall official. And then I also write my email list every day, which I know for some people might sound a bit like, oh my God, that's overwhelming. But I get emails from people almost daily saying, I cannot wait to receive your email every day. I make sure that I sit down with a cup of tea and I read it. I carry something from it every day. It's not a newsletter, it's a love letter. So people are really welcome to come onto my email list. And I don't just talk about yes parenting. I talk about neurodivergent life. I talk about like my spirituality and experiencing life as a sacred adventure is really important to me. So I kind of talk about that. I just kind of pour my heart out, I suppose. But also that daily email is a great way to find out what I'm offering. So the best way I'm going to share this out loud, even though if I was listening, I would find this really hard to hear this out loud. But it's beamarshall.com, which is my website, /quick-links. And the first thing on that page is a form in order to be able to subscribe. So that's another way. And yeah.
Brilliant. Well, I know we have a lot of people who listen to this who are neurodivergent themselves, or they have children who are neurodivergent, so they can relate very much to the journey that you've been on. And I'm sure we'll love some of your top tips as you navigate that yourself, and your wisdom, which goes beyond the top tips. So thank you so much for coming onto the podcast and sharing your story. I really appreciate it, Bea.
Thanks for having me, Joy.
All right. Well, that was a fun podcast, especially for me. Bea and I met on an online course, and she's been a great cheerleader of mine. And so I wanted to be a cheerleader of hers and bring her on to the Career Interrupted podcast, because I knew she had some wisdom for you. So I hope you have a wonderful week. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this, and I'll catch you next week with a new podcast episode. Bye for now.